Hi, everyone. My name is Marcello, and I'm here representing the Services Fabric team from Intuit. And I'd like to talk to you about configuration management at Intuit today. We are actually with our journey to the cloud. And for some, it may be a very daunting thing to accomplish. Intuit is actually a 20-year-old startup plus. We have a lot of mix of old code and new code being developed and maintained. And due to that, we have this commitment to move to AWS, which is our selected cloud solution. And teams have moved their code to the cloud a little bit in a slow pace. Our infrastructure is actually defined as everything as a service. Basically, developers develop a service that they want to share to other engineers. And basically, our infrastructure only allows, or was it only allowing, developers to develop the binary of their application and deliver it to our repositories along with their configuration. So teams with shared configurations had a hard time to actually move faster, right? And those services in the directory where they actually show their service, they actually are available to everyone at that point. So as I was saying, developers get their software and their binary and configuration together and push there to Nexus, for example, our repository, and then to build their applications. However, there is a lot of concerns around, some, older teams maintaining older code. They actually have that mindset. If it's working, don't touch. And if it's in production and it's working, do not touch, because we did QA and everything. So it's a little bit fragile, but things have changed. So what we needed to do at that point was to actually step back and look at what configuration service management or config management is and what is not. And today, because we have different teams across all Intuit, we defined that for now, configuration management was not operational system settings. And putting that aside, we then defined that configuration management, what we want to solve today, was only application level configuration. Those are the business logic that you guys put on the source code or in the configuration to allow your source code to run. And some of those property values, in this case, they are actually secrets, right? You have database passwords and credentials and so on. So we had to take that into consideration. And also, we are at a spring conference, and as a Java developer, you actually use configuration property files to define those configurations. So then what we had to do in this case was to look at those requirements and look at what we wanted to do and draw requirements about what we wanted as a solution to solve this kind of problems we had. One, as we move to the cloud, we wanted a solution that is cloud ready around standardization and being able to allow our developers to move very fast, right, with minimal impact, which means those teams doing everything manual and binary change and so on would not be in place. So if you look at and revisit the 12-factor, it has the number 3 specification around configuration, right? The strict separation of config from code. That allows you to go to the cloud in a very smooth way in terms of configuration. And what we wanted is to actually build that binary that developers went, fixed the code, generated a binary, but it could be reused throughout different environments, which is the separation of environment at that point. One of the problems we kind of started seeing was that some developers or ops engineers would go to the boxes during the craziness of production changes and change values in multiple boxes in a fleet, for example. We wanted to have a single source of truth. In this case, where the configuration is changed and located, we wanted to make sure that we know what that is, right? We want all the changes to be auditable, and historically available so that you know when someone changed and what changed and when that change was done. And finally, we were looking at the integration with our internal services, and one of them was our secret service, where we actually manage how users define by secrets, right, in this case. So we actually then sat back with a couple of teams who were already looking for solutions, and one of them was the TurboTax team. And a couple of months ago, last year, we started looking at those teams who were actually using Spring Cloud Config as a solution for configuration. And their requirement was, well, we have an iOS team, we have an Android team, we need to change one single property. And that one single property during production would take hours and a lot of resources and synchronization among them. And they were looking at one single place where they can change those properties. So we started then evaluating Spring Cloud Config as our configuration service. So we actually worked around the configuration service and client to support backend services. And in order to support their service, we actually implemented something called Config Publisher, which I will get into details. Let's drill down now to configuration service. As I was mentioning, then the Spring Cloud configuration service, we deployed as our config service. And it is the consolidated view or instance of the configuration service that actually was put in place in the services directory. So every engineer into it can now take advantage of it. And in addition to that, we actually selected GitHub as our volume management. As you know, Spring Cloud supports multiple volumes. You can use backends for the configuration properties. And since we have a GitHub Enterprise instance into it, we actually took advantage of it. So in order to start using the service directory, we actually need to go through the same process as every service at Intuit. One, we need to harden it around security, performance, and logging monitoring. And the reason why is because we actually secure every service, of course. And one of the important things that we actually worked internally was around performance with the support of conditional requests to the configuration service to actually avoid a round trip to GitHub. So this was one of the performance improvements we actually put in place. And what we then learned after we started experimenting with GitHub was that we actually got everything we wanted. One, we had the auditability. We knew who was doing commits of configuration. Users, like the teams, were like, wow, someone just changed this value. And now you can see those values in the configuration coming up when you were fetching them. And you know the history of who changed the what. And so some teams, depending on the level of expertise on Git flow processes, actually helps you a lot because the APIs and configuration service has the views of branches and tags and so on, right? So basically the same thing was actually done on the client side. So the client side actually went through the same hardening. We actually made available an augmented version of a Spring Cloud Config client for the Spring Boot teams. So teams now started learning, well, there's Spring Boot, makes it a very easy and fast way to create a new service, right, for those new teams. And not only that, customers then, like engineers now coming with older Java applications were like, wait a minute, this thing actually, I heard about this configuration service. It makes it so simple to separate binary code and configuration. So we also would like to have a Java version for it. So our team actually then spent some time to implement a Spring version and a plain Java client to actually serve those customers. And what then we started learning about the features around auto configuration, right? That actually helped us to re-architect and re-implement small little libraries that could be helpful. In this case, the integration with our secret management. Spring Cloud Config Server offers a cipher infrastructure where you define secrets. We actually implemented our own little library with our secret token that actually communicates with our secret service and dynamically serves secrets. So it was a very great integration. And finally, one piece that we wanted to implement was in regards to resiliency. In this case, to persist the current state in S3 bucket. If it's local or in S3, the service would be with always the state available. So this is kind of like the basic diagram of what teams are going through, right? You see on the left side different applications at Intuit using the configuration service to retrieve now those properties separated from the binaries. And those properties are coming from a GitHub repo. And as you know, and as you see totally separate individuals managing their own GitHub repos. And because it's a single config service, we actually worked around onboarding those customers, and we know who those customers are. So we know which configuration repos are there for those customers. So in this case, every individual on the team is completely free to do their own changes at any time because the configuration service is going to be able to serve those configurations. One important piece here, if you see at the QuickBooks application, once you fetch configuration, you can actually delay when secrets will be processed. In this case, we process on the client side because it's actually contacting the secret service, which is just like below. And finally, again, like the last state will be always saved if enabled by all the configuration properties in an S3 bucket, allowing customers to be resilient. So then comes the requirement around those teams that I just mentioned, the TurboTax team. They had the iOS and Android teams who wanted to change a specific property around production time. And comes like tax season, it's a craziness around Intuit in our division. And imagine you having to put teams together to synchronize on, hey, I need to change one property. And guess what? There's multiple teams and there's multiple applications and so on. So what then we definitely wanted to do with it was that, okay, we learned about Spring Cloud Config. It offers different APIs. You can actually store the properties once in GitHub in properties or YAML files and actually retrieve them in JSON, properties, or YAML, the same exact set of properties. So that was a winning piece where developers were like, well, we can use that as a tooling. And then we decided to implement something that empowers engineers to declare what they wanted to be published. In this case, we were looking at, okay, so if we want to put this to the cloud and be a serverless solution, what we would do? Well, we looked at the config service API, and we noticed it's a very static and well-defined API resource, right? You have the label concept, the app name profiles extension. And then we looked at, like, can we just map that to a S3 bucket? And whenever the users say, I want this set of permutations of things, I want to push it to an S3 bucket. And there we go. We got a pattern. And then we actually, what the publisher will do is actually to push configuration on the same exact format so that in your configuration application or your mobile app, now you can just switch from configuration service to S3 directly. But of course, consuming the final configuration and the extension needed. And finally, we actually just added a few capabilities, in this case, to identify, to help clients identify and prevent man-in-the-middle attacks, because you don't know if the configurations were tampered with in S3. So we put things in place. And it's basically the same kind of scenario, right? You have the TurboTax team, back-end services, multiple services, using the configuration service, Spring Cloud Config, in this case, using the same repo, and now you see multiple teams, the iOS team and the Android team sharing now the same exact repo. Remember, I want to change the same exact value of a property in production in 2 minutes. And it was very clear now to them how they synchronize around pull requests, right? Git flow and any process you want to use, they are now very flexible to choose whatever they need. And the publisher system, in this case, first they have to add some metadata in the repo that the publisher service will actually look at and then see in every single commit and see, okay, the developers want us to publish those permutations of configurations to S3. In this case, allowing those customers, mobile app engineers, to completely implement straight to S3 or to the configuration service. And this is what it looks like. For those who are familiar with the app name, profiles list, it may look very familiar. The list of files always start with an application name, dash, and the profiles. It's basically the finishing product of the publisher is a populated bucket. And you can see I just put the webhook delivery ID is how you actually trace back to a commit. Right, so developers now know when you push a commit, you see on the webhook delivery ID what was the actual version published to S3. It's very quick. So then after those teams started getting familiarized with configuration service and very happy, like, wow, I can move so fast. We started identifying a couple of things that we needed to do. There were some gaps. One, the knowledge around Spring Cloud environment, profiles, labels. Imagine you explain this to a Node.js developer, right, who never implemented anything in Spring. So what then we had to do was to get a lot of feedback. We were receiving a lot of feedback from different teams. And then one of them was that it's very difficult to migrate from a mindset where you had configuration properties and you would define what the order of overriding was before. And there was no such a concept of app name, label, and profiles. And specifically in label because it's more related to Git, which labeling in Spring Cloud config is basically loading the labels in the GitHub APIs is it can be the show ID, the branch, or tags. So what we needed to do in this case was to document the best practices around it and document the design model about how you would now separate the configuration from what you had in your application to the config service repo in this case, right? And then one important piece was that some engineers started coming to us like, wait, it's very hard to understand the resolution of a given value. Like it's a mental model that you have to actually, after you read the documentation, you are going to see that the permutation on the profile sequence actually will dictate which files are loaded first and after. So it was like, yeah, that's actually very interesting. You know, how can we solve that problem? And one of the pieces is like when you now add the different values that comes from different labels. Imagine you're like, I'm using the branch, feature branch, and now I have like the configuration. I want to point my server to go to the release branch, or even keep it master. And it's like, wow, I see different values because someone sent a pull request here and there. So in order to overcome that, we actually came up with a solution called Intuit Spring Cloud Config Inspector. We actually got an intern for 3 months where our team coached, and we got a solution actually based on this feedback. One, we wanted to have a very simple way to inspect a configuration repo and render those values and quickly tell you what the values of a given property is based on the app name, label, and profiles. And then, in this case, you're going to be very quick in terms of debugging what the current state is without making the mental model, right, of the API and what the values are. So we developed as an embeddable and as a standalone React application. This same app we open sourced a week ago, is actually used in production in our own the service directory, as I mentioned, as an embeddable application where it calls the configuration service, our configuration service. And it's open sourced as Apache. You guys are welcome to start contributing. And basically, this is what it is, right? Users go to the GitHub repo, and this is a forked repo from Spring, and you have an application full and like 2 files for different profiles, right? And what we wanted to do was to actually give users the view of that without them thinking. So here's the view of the keys coming from those files. There is a filter capability. You see color and full and info description being filtered keys. And now you see how the resolution of the variable full took place. In this case, full.properties is loaded, and then full.development.properties was loaded. And this is actually in the rules of configuration service. When you make a request, you actually see the metadata file showing what were the files loaded in which order, and then you see the other APIs that actually merge the values in the final resolved configuration. So in this case, we started then like, okay, what the developers want. One, they wanted to, like, now the iOS team was like, I want a YAML file because I'm developing a YAML. And then came Node.js developers. I want to see the JSON file because I just want to copy very quick and use. So we have the raw view where you can actually select and choose what the actual payload is coming from configuration service right there. JSON, YAML property, and the metadata file, which is the call that the Spring Cloud client API will be calling. And one other piece was that we actually put in place some tooling around loading and parsing the GitHub state. In this case, you know the labels are any branch and any tags. Obviously, we did not want to put all the SHA IDs, but we decided to actually offer the labels as the tags and the branches that you have in your GitHub repo, and the profile list to be the actual parsing of the files that you have in GitHub, right? And usually, you actually can declare and decide what is the sequence. And after selecting, the files were, like, we are fetching the configuration properties directly from config service right away. One important piece was that those teams doing Git flow, they noticed, like, wow, like, what if we had a way to do a diff quickly in Spring Cloud config between 2 different labels so that I know what is in QA and what is in production are different. And there you go. We got actually that capability. We used the .properties and the .json APIs to actually do a diff, and users can just like navigate through the 2 different sides, as you can see, master production and master development, and then now you start selecting what profiles are. And you see exactly what keys were changed in which of the environments. So then we started going like, well, let's actually give the users the view, number 1 on the right, the GitHub view. What is the config repo that I'm using? Well, sometimes you're like, can you call this config service using the app full XYZ? You actually don't know where the configuration is coming from until you call the metadata API. So you see configuration repo, it's the GitHub repo XYZ, right? So then we also actually show the order in which the configuration file properties were loaded. Very quickly, you see actually also the API logs that we actually had to call. So those users who are actually migrating from the pre-Spring Cloud or anything else, they actually can even learn how to use the APIs, right? Looking at the output of this view. So switching now to gears to another piece of problems we started getting from our customers, and we needed to support. Actually, users can break configuration very easily because now everything is so simple. Go to the GitHub repo, click in edit configuration property, and guess what? You can just start typing, right, what you want to change. However, manually change your configuration properties, it's so easy, but actually is very, you can actually inject the problems very easily. So if you mistype a YAML file or a property file, you put like a $sign or a bracket, you actually can break Spring Cloud Config Server. And those are the serious consequences. One, for the config service, it will not load the property. And two, the user who actually made the commit was going to be like, wait, I made the commit and I'm still waiting the auto refresh, right? If you're in Spring Boot, and you haven't got even the configuration yet. And why? The reason why is because the configuration service actually never processed because it actually got a 500 in the backend. So then what we came up with was a way to validate the configurations before it comes to GitHub, which is our single source of truth. We came up with the Intuit Spring Cloud Config Validator, which unfortunately only for those users or teams who are using GitHub Enterprise. GitHub Enterprise offers something called a pre-receive hook, which actually it is a Docker container plus a repo with a script that you can put, and actually can validate any pre-merge of commits to a given repo. In this case, we created a very simple Python script that validates JSON, YAML, and .property files. And it will validate in any moment you're trying to push configuration. Manual commits pushed through the CLI. You're just in your terminal, you do a git push. You're not going to get it if you inject the problems there. Through the UI, you're changing configurations very quickly, and you push something wrong that we actually say it's malformed, we're not going to accept that commit. And imagine now pull requests, right? You have contributors, and like, I need this configuration, and they make various commits. You don't want to validate configuration manually. So pull requests are also verified. So in order to do that, you actually have to work with your ops engineers to actually deploy the Docker image to run as a container in your GitHub appliance. And you go to the hooks and services, and actually you enable it. We already named as a configuration validator. And then after that, you are going to get all the goodies of automatic validation. It's basically if I just type anything on a YAML file without the proper colon, for example, it's going to tell me that file is actually wrong, right? At the same time, I received a pull request. There were a couple of commits that were wrong, big errors in JSON, YAML files were there. I tried to merge that. And remember, if you have an internal open source culture, you're going to see that happening because it's so easy to get broken. And now we are not breaking configuration service anymore. Our onboarding service automatically enables configuration validator to all our customers' repos. So then what is for the future? What we want to work next? And what we are doing, and finally, what we are declaring so far. As we were expecting, we wanted something very simple and quick. Spring Cloud Configuration Server actually helped us to make that paradigm shift that we had from manually updating configurations and putting inside of binaries, and now we have everything separate, right? It did require a little bit of education, documentation, and helped us to migrate, and he's helping our teams to migrate to the cloud, especially some teams using Docker containers. They want to get the configuration right there quickly. And the configuration publisher actually empowered those customers. We actually had shared configuration, and we wanted multiple APIs and multiple configuration properties for the same values, right? So this team, then TurboTax team last year, they could get now changes that went from hours to just a couple of minutes after receiving and merging the configuration properties to their branches. And unfortunately, we actually had plans to open source the publisher. We delayed a little bit the work. We are going to hopefully work in the next quarter. And finally, the config inspector and validator has helped us tremendously around productivity. Now, customers, one, they don't need to worry about changes that are quickly needs to be put in place. And finally, like they can now, don't call us for, we like customers calling us for support, but we want to empower them to see on their own what they have. And with that, I conclude, and I'm here for questions. Sure.
One of the slides you mentioned that you integrated the config servers, encryption, decryption with your in-house backend secret service.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're encrypting, I'm assuming you're using the config ability to encrypt like sensitive values while it's sitting in the Github repository. Are you still going through the config server to do that encryption, decryption, or are you, and that's just kind of delegating back to your backend secret service, or are you still doing all your encryption, decryption in the secret service? Like when you have a new password that you want to store in Git, do you do that encryption through the config server or from your backend secret service?
So the question is in regards if we manage the configuration of secrets in the files and if the configuration service is the one processing that secret. Is that correct?
Yeah, specifically the encryption. If you
Right.
have a password you need to store in GitHub,
Right.
where do you go to do that encryption? Config server or your backend secret server?
Yeah, so users then go separately to our secret management service. They define their secret, and they use actually a token, and there is a kind of a URL of the secret, right? And with that, remember Spring Cloud Config uses a cipher token and the secret that is encrypted there. And what we have is something a little bit simpler. We define our own secret token, and then we actually have a kind of a URL to the secret that we want to, where you want your application now to fetch. So the configuration service is going to maintain the same thing you put in the configuration properties, and the configuration service doesn't even touch it. Like until the Spring Cloud Config Now client will identify that, and our library will be kicking in process that at runtime.
Okay, so the kind of the decryption takes place in the client itself.
Correct.
Communicates with your backend secret service.
Correct. Yes.
There's actually no encryption. There's secrets that are passed from secret management forever.
It's kind of like there's the cred file I think they recently introduced that does something similar to that, where you pass in like it does interpolation basically. You pass in the value and sends you back the real values. You just have placeholders there. That's not right.
Right. Any more questions? Yes? Can you repeat?
How does this work with your change management process? Manual process?
So how does our solution integrates with our change management? In this case, if you're talking about changing of configuration, none. Because now developers are empowered to do change at any moment, and obviously work around the team to make sure that you're not changing anything in the production. Production servers are reading a specific set of profiles and label, right? And then all the way, you can play around the QA or develop environments, but then the process gets more and more rigorous when you want to do the change in whatever environment set, whatever set of changes, profile, label settings is your production environment pointing to.
And GitHub Enterprise lets you control access to branches. Nail down production branch.
Yeah, so just to repeat here, GitHub allows you to control the permissions to who will be able to write to a given branch. Specifically in GitHub Enterprise, it's very helpful. So you can now select those users are the ones allowed to merge a pull request to master, for example. If production points to master, at this point your configuration, management definitely is secure. Yes.
Here, how do you do service
So your question is in regards to how the configuration property.
To serve like a database.
Yes. So basically what you are storing in the configuration properties is actually an address or a token where the configuration secret is located. And at the runtime, the application is going to basically get as is from the configuration repo through the configuration server, and the client will just open up that, while doing the bindings for auto configuration, it's going to identify the token for the secret, and it will say, oh, okay, so this secret is actually located in our secret management service. Let me now exchange that information, having all the necessary credentials. Your service will be able to call the configuration secret service, or the secret service, and fetch that configuration that relates to what you actually put in place in your configuration repo. And that automatically, only at runtime and in memory, will be holding the values. For example, database password, right? That now you made your service able to call, but you don't see that value at any place, right? You don't store it, you don't, you just don't make it easily accessible, right? For any hacker or anybody. Getting access to the box. Everything is in memory. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and say not that you decided you didn't need integration or send it to your server label or branch of department. How do you, say you are building this feature to QA, how do you propagate those new changes to the QA environment? Is that make fashion? Is that manual process to see the difference that you merge?
Yeah, so the question is how those configuration goes from one environment to another. So using, basically the configuration server is waiting, is loading whatever it's available in GitHub. At that point, when you make a change in configuration server, the configuration servers get like a message through the webhook, and they auto-refresh the properties. And your client, if you're using the refresh scope, for example, will automatically get those changes. This is like a Spring Boot, auto-configuration, refresh scope set of tooling. Your application gets it automatically, without anything, without you having to click another button. As soon as you make a configuration change, at a couple of seconds, you're going to get those changes propagated to all the fleet of your services that are pointing to that specifically set that is saying, well, it's the QA branch. So anytime you make that change in QA, you're going to get those properties automatically in your application. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but what's more, how do you get new config change in the branch department into the branch of QA?
So it basically, you as manager of your own GitHub repo, you manage the Git flow, right? You can do a pull request. You can just copy paste. Like usually we use Git flows for that. But yeah. Oh, good. Sounds good. Yeah, Git flows. Well, I have to thank you guys. I think my time is up. Thank you for coming, and see you soon.